Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Welcome. Thank you both for your service. General, the Sagamore and the Bourne bridges are the only two roads connecting Cape Cod to Massachusetts. I don't have to tell you that at all. But regrettably, these two 80-year-old bridges, which are crucial evacuation routes, since it's the only way off, are structurally deficient. The Corps of Engineers maintains the bridges and is currently conducting a study to evaluate whether they need to be replaced. General, as an agency charged with reducing risks from disaster, how does the Corps of Engineers rehabilitate bridges that serve an essential public safety and commercial function? And would it be helpful if Congress created an authority that dedicates federal funding for the replacement or restoration of these types of assets, and then allows the Corps to divest the bridges to be able to able and willing non-federal partners?
Senator, I strongly agree with you that we've got to do something different on bridging. We have 897 bridges. Some of these are small ones across like the Intercoastal Waterway, but those two you talked about, and I was on those 4 months ago, and as well as about 5 gigantic bridges we have in Pennsylvania, are big, big bills. Right now, per bridge, each one of those, if we rehab it, it's going to be $300 million. If we replace it, it's going to be about $400 million. So you're talking about an $800 million deficit. Now the question is, does the federal government need to be able to keep bridges in our inventory? And this goes back to, I would recommend that we've got to go down this path of finding a way to divest those. It'd be great if the state came in and took those over, but the state's probably going to say, we'll only do that once you bring them up to a given standard. So we want to work with the committee to try to find ways, and it goes back to critical infrastructure and water. If we can figure out how to somehow bring down some of the bills that we have for these old bridges, then we're able to use that same money, assuming Congress keeps appropriating that, into other areas. It might be a better return on investment back for the nation.
And I agree with you. And that's why federal money is so important.
Yes, sir.
We've got that leverage going into a negotiation on an issue like that.
Well, and early on, I said, what about innovative approaches? This goes back to where is a local or state interest to be able to step up to take some of these things over. And we just got a lot of inventory in the federal government. I'd love to see some of this divested back into locals that maybe can take care of it and budget for it better than we can.
Thank you, sir. So I've always supported environmentally responsible shoreline protection projects where sand is pumped onto beaches to protect against storm surge and coastal erosion. But when the town of Sandwich, Massachusetts, attempted to use sand from the federal Cape Cod Canal that otherwise would be dumped in the ocean to protect their community, federal requirements became a major obstacle. The U.S. Army Corps required the homeowners to provide easements ceding away their coastal property line forever, even though the sand from this beneficial use project would only remain on the beach for 5 years. Ultimately, the town was unable to use federal funding for this essential shoreline protection project, which to me makes no sense at all. So, General, should we explore opportunities to make the Corps project requirements more flexible for these beneficial use of dredge material projects? Shouldn't we find better ways to ensure that these requirements are not preventing the Corps from using quality sediment for beach nourishment and aquatic restoration?
So, Senator, I'm a big fan of considering dredge material as a resource, as regional sediment management. There's a lot of places that we can put this type sand to do exactly what you're talking about. There is current policy, though, that if, in fact, we use beach renourishment, then at some given point there are local homeowners association there and access back to that beach. I'm not specifically aware of the project in Sandwich. I'd like to think that somewhere we could have figured out a solution somewhere, but if nothing else, we'll certainly find out, and I'll talk to the New England district and figure out what happened and how can we somehow figure out, without perhaps challenging the policy that is a national policy, how could we have found a better way to use that sand? Right. Taking it out to the ocean, sir, is a waste of a good resource.
It is a waste of a good resource, and saying you have to give up permanent in order to get something that only lasts for 5 years is something that ultimately then reached stalemate, and so that's not good. And finally, if I may, for some communities in Massachusetts, Wellfleet, Plymouth, New Bedford, Essex, Gloucester, Newburyport, the waterways are filling up with so much sand that vessels cannot reliably and safely pass, which harms commerce, recreation, and safety. Many of these waterways are federally owned, and it's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' responsibility to dredge these waterways. And that's why I believe that we should use all of the resources in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for these important dredging projects, instead of raiding that pot of vital funding for deficit reduction as we are doing now. And I hope that we can address this issue in the upcoming Water Resources Bill. And maybe if you could, General, just give us a few comments on that issue in terms of the resources you need in order to get the job done in communities like Wellfleet and others that I just mentioned.
Sir, I'll just hit on the current dredging. We clearly have a lot more requirements right now than we have funds, so we do have to prioritize, and we have a relatively deliberate formula as to where can we dredge and where we can't. I'll let Mr. Fisher address the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, but we definitely have requirements that exceed our capabilities, and that means in some areas we have not been able to dredge, and some of those rivers have almost gone into a caretaker status because we've not been able to do what we need to do to protect the federal waterways.
Okay.
Sir, I would just add, I'm very aware of the balance, the large balance in the trust fund, as you mentioned, and we certainly want to make sure that those fees that are collected are targeted to the improvements they were intended to be.
Because these communities are really under stress, and it's a nationwide issue, and so the more that we can work on that project, and maybe in the infrastructure bill, I think the better it would be for the economy of our country as well, for the growth that is possible, because you're dealing with these central issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.